Oh, hi there, friends. Mandy here. Restorative grief is all about creating easy access to healing no matter where or who you are. That's why I want you to remember that if you want grief support beyond a podcast, my 31-day guidebook is available to order on Amazon. Embracing our losses without losing ourselves is a reflective journey into the holistic needs of grievers and learning to support yourself, mind, heart, body, and spirit. Don't just wing it. You can lean into grief work with a guide. The link for the book and more are available in the show notes, and as always, you can reach out with questions. But for now, let's get on to this week's episode. Welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. You are listening to episode 197, titled Held Together with Rebecca N. Thompson. Learning to tell our story as a griever is an art form, a transformation, and a necessary part of the healing process, but it can often feel unsafe to get started. In her new book, Held Together, a shared memoir of motherhood, medicine, and imperfect love, author Rebecca N. Thompson, MD, explores the many ways that grief shows up in the world of parenting. Her own work as a family medicine and public health physician wasn't exactly insulation against her own pregnancy complications and losses, but it did allow her to begin creating a container where others in similar situations could learn to tell their stories too. Whether you are a grieving parent yourself or not, this episode is for all of us, as Rebecca shares how exploring moments where grief and joy converge led her to a decade-long collaborative storytelling project with her patients, friends, and medical colleagues that has led to an abundance of healing and understanding, and most importantly, empathy. Hey everyone, welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. I'm your host, Mandy, and today I'm joined by new author Rebecca N. Thompson, MD. She's a family medicine and public health physician who specializes in women's and children's health, and she's the author of Held Together, a shared memoir of motherhood, medicine, and imperfect love. She's joining me today to talk about the experience of going through pregnancy complications and losses as a doctor herself, the many ways that grief can play a role in parenthood, and how exploring moments where grief and joy converge led her to a decade-long collaborative storytelling project with her patients, friends, and her medical colleagues. Rebecca, that's so beautiful. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you.
Absolutely. And I want to get right into it. Longtime listeners know I am no stranger to fertility issues and family grief, but I do know that some of our listeners might be. So, how did you decide that this storytelling project was the right next thing for you as a grieving parent?
So, back when I was a new physician, just fresh out of training, finishing up my training, my husband and I went through 3 complicated pregnancy losses, including 2 that were life-threatening to me. And at that time, I just felt really isolated, even as a doctor with wonderful friends who were in medicine who would understand what I was going through. It felt like everything was happening so fast and so relentlessly that we never quite managed to tell our story. And that was partly in the overwhelm, partly in not wanting to be felt seen as an object of pity. Uh, so, for a long time, for too long, I really didn't talk about what we'd been struggling with. It seemed like everyone around me was having babies and holding toddler birthday parties, and we just felt like we were the only ones being left behind. But as soon as I started to give even a little glimmer of what we'd been experiencing or allude to the fact that it had been hard, things weren't going as we had hoped, everyone around me seemed to have a story. And anytime I shared the smallest glimpse into our story, details just started pouring out from friends, from my patients, from my colleagues at work. And I realized pretty quickly that everybody wanted to talk about this. There just wasn't a space for it, not enough space for it anyway. So that, in a whole other story, led me to go back and do a second residency with more training in women's and children's health. And I do talk about that in the book. It's a huge part of our story. But in terms of how I knew this was the next right thing, this project, well, as I got to know more of these stories and as I just found them these stories found me, right? As I started to open up to them, I really knew that I wanted to use this privilege to collect the stories somehow, to gather them together, to create a space for others to benefit from them and not just have them stand for the individual experiences of the 22 of us in this book.
Yeah. You said something right at the beginning.
Mm.
We weren't sharing because we didn't want anyone to be pitying
Mm-hmm.
us or
Mm-hmm.
expressing that. I think that is so much more common than we might be able to admit. Can you speak to that a bit more?
Yeah, well, I've always been a very do it yourself, think of myself as resilient, creative, outside the box thinker, and able to kind of get through whatever life would throw at me. And there's this disconnect there when you see yourself as strong, and you are strong, right? But you don't want other people to think that you're not. It's in conflict with your narrative and your identity. And that's different from being willing to be vulnerable. It's not that I wasn't willing to be vulnerable. That's, I think, what ultimately led me to want to open up about it. I was comfortable with that. I just, I didn't want to give the impression that we weren't going to figure this out.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to think that myself because I didn't believe that, but it was really hard in the moment.
Yeah. I mean, that makes me think about this idea that we have used, like you said, a narrative
Mm-hmm.
in our minds, and this also belief somewhere along the line that came in and said, that doesn't happen to us. That might happen to other
Mm-hmm.
people. It couldn't be happening to us. So we have this hopefulness
Mm-hmm.
that is embedded, but it lacks nuance. It
Mm-hmm.
lacks subtlety. It lacks that fullness that says, well, why not
Mm-hmm.
us? In both directions. So let's just talk about people like you and I who've dealt with
Mm-hmm.
infertility and pregnancy loss,
Mm-hmm.
and we can even go so far to talk about adoption and fostering and the different ways that we try to build our family units.
Mm-hmm.
What about those people who are dealing with even the medical procedures, IVF
Mm-hmm.
and surrogacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do they begin to explore their stories if they're finding themselves, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sharing out of a fear of pity, or I'm not sharing out of a fear of admitting that perhaps why not us kind of a mentality.
Well, it's okay not to be in that space right away, right? I
Mm.
certainly wasn't ready to this book. It took many, many years to write, and even before that it took a bunch of years to realize it needed to be written. I couldn't have done this in the thick of things. And so just to say that I think these stories and that possibility of telling your own story, it can appeal to people at any stage of the process, but I think in some ways it's most beneficial for people who've sort of worked their way through, and I won't say gotten through, like not overcome necessarily, but worked their way through part of the process already. And they
Mm.
have this understanding that things are complicated. They don't really expect a straight path anymore. And they're willing to hold space for those nuances. Like you said, it's hard to allow for nuances in these situations sometimes.
Yeah. Let's talk about this idea of mourning the loss of our innocence
Mm,
as hopeful parents, as potential
mm-hmm,
parents,
mm-hmm,
and what that experience is like as a person who can get pregnant.
mm-hmm,
For me, I was only successfully pregnant once, all the way through one time.
mm-hmm,
And I knew it would be the easiest pregnancy. My family had a very long history of easy pregnancies and easy births. And ultimately it was. I was so fortunate. But the anxiety
mm-hmm,
of going through
mm-hmm.
that pregnancy and wondering every step
Yes.
of the way, is this
Oh,
going to cause a miscarriage?
oh.
Is this the wrong move? With the exception of eating sushi. I will tell you, I ate a lot of sushi. My physician was so wonderful. She looked at me and says, "What do you think they eat in Japan when they are pregnant?"
Right.
And I was like, "Oh, do they eat sushi? How ethnocentric of me. I can't wait to go eat sushi now."
Well, then, yeah, you'll enjoy that part of the story about the sushi dinner with Shreya and Kyle in our,
Yep.
in our
Yep.
group. We probably laughed at that one. I
Yep.
would forego the sushi. I think what you're touching on is the different layers of grief around fertility issues. And so the way that I experience this, at least, so there's this initial struggle, this initial challenge. There's grief during the initial challenges of wishing for that straightforward path. You may have imagined thinking that your family was going to come together a certain way, or just having a hard time being patient, just leaving space, waiting for these things that you'd wished for, and watching other people get them while you don't. There's that whole first layer of the absence. You're grieving the absence of something, right? But then as you move, if you're fortunate enough to move out of that phase and become a parent in whatever way that happens for you and your family, you carry these other values, these other perspectives with you from that experience. And it's the loss of innocence is really the huge one, what you mentioned. So even if you're now pregnant or you even have a living child in front of you, you have a different perspective on that than a person who hasn't gone through complications to get there. And so to me, there's this fear of losing what you have that lingers. Part of that is a guardedness. Part of that is just realistic. I mean, once you've been through these things, you know that anything can happen, right? But I think there's a really beautiful sentiment in the chapter about Olivia's story, and she's talking about um, again, like not necessarily having the family that she might have had if something had gone differently in her life, and lamenting that, but appreciating what she has. And she says um, that so much of fear is simply love. And that the sentiment is that fear signals that we really value something, and it would break our hearts to lose it. And we carry that as parents who've had a hard time becoming parents, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an incredibly profound statement as well. And it allows us to pause and consider, what am I putting forward as the values and the beliefs around this situation
Mm-hmm.
and my expectations on it? Am I moving forward or toward something with a lens of fear
Mm-hmm.
for valid reasons?
Mm-hmm.
Always, almost always.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly for invalid reasons or less practical, reasonable, just whatever you want to say. But I would even champion people to say, like, that is true. There is fear involved. And what does a lens of moving forward in love, with openness, with
Mm-hmm.
curiosity, with patience for
Mm-hmm.
myself when fear gets a lot louder
Yeah.
in this process? Because that's one thing I think was really profound about your book, is that there's so much both and
Yes.
complexity that's explored and expressed
Yeah.
in what the people are going through.
I really appreciate that you noticed that. And that was something that stood out for you, because that is certainly my intention. And I think where this intersects with your work is these are the spaces, the crucial points where grief really does intersect with joy.
Mhm.
And I think as parents who've been through a lot to become parents, we have a heightened sense of appreciation sometimes. Not that people who haven't can't have that as well. We all come to family life with perspectives on how things could have been different. And I'm not saying that families who've been through complicated pregnancies have a monopoly on that. Not at all. But it makes me think about in so many of the stories where we feel like we wouldn't have chosen what we went through. We wouldn't have said, "Oh, I definitely want that to happen because then I can appreciate things more." That's not what I'm getting at. But there really is a more acute feeling of knowing that we couldn't be where we are now if we hadn't been through what we'd been through. So we're grateful for the lessons from those experiences, even if we never would have chosen the experiences themselves.
Yeah. You know, I just reread Kate Bowler's No Cure for Being Human, and she's talking specifically about that thing too. All of these things that you want to go through, that you want to experience. Um, and she says, everybody pretends that you can only die once, but that's not true. You can die 1,000 possible futures in the course of a single stupid life. And
Yes, great.
that's precisely what she's coming down to as she's talking about that is I didn't
Mm-hmm.
expect any of this. And, you know, eventually, spoiler, she lives.
Yeah.
And there's so much that she learned about herself and the need to become more present and more
Mm-hmm.
appreciative and not in a shame-filled, you should appreciate what you have kind of a way, but certainly in a wow, new lens.
Mm-hmm.
Whoa, veil torn.
Mm-hmm.
What
Mm-hmm.
bright colors these are. What
Mm-hmm.
incredible tones that child's laughter contains.
Right.
We see things through a lens of impermanence, I think, that comes when we've dealt with
Yeah,
permanent losses
that's
so
beautifully
often.
put. That's beautifully
Mm,
put. I think it's also, it's not just about the loss of the thing itself. It's those two levels of loss again. It's about the loss of potential, the loss of some imagined future.
mhm.
There's grieving the loss of a pregnancy, a child, a spouse, a family member, but then there's a whole other level of grieving, not just their absence, but what you had envisioned with
Yeah. Yeah. Let's transition a tiny bit from that
them.
and talk about extended family members,
Mm-hmm.
grandparents that don't get to become grandparents,
Mm-hmm.
friends who don't get to become bonus aunties and uncles,
Mm-hmm.
and the most well-intentioned humans in our lives do and say the things that they don't realize are causing so much hurt, but also they're trying to connect with someone and with their own pain over the situation. How do you support or talk to people who are in that kind of secondary role of family loss in some way? What would you
Mm-hmm.
say to those people that can kind of mitigate harm, but also validate what they're experiencing as well?
This makes me think about something I know you talk a lot about in your work, which is that it's not about the words we say, it's about the space that we hold for people.
Mhm.
So, reassuring those support people, extended family members, friends, that they don't have to know the perfect thing to say at all times. They just can be there for someone and be open to what that person needs. And their role is never about fixing. Healing is not about being fixed. It's not about finding an endpoint or coming up with solutions. It's about taking what we can take from our experiences and learning and growing. And healing is not even always positive, but it is always active and engaged and open to possibility.
Mm. Not always positive. Say more about that.
This makes me think about some of the chapters in the book, some of the women's stories who they reflect on how when they miss their person, it's not even most acute in times of sadness. It really comes up for them in times of celebration.
Yeah.
So I think of stories about pregnancy and child loss and how, they think of their missing their lost child when they're celebrating something, a birthday with another child, or someone who lost a parent. And she talks about at every milestone, she wishes that her mother were there to
Mm.
to watch her grow.
Yeah.
And that those moments are actually the hardest because these women are experiencing joy. People around them are all joyful, but
Mm.
their celebration is always tinged with sadness.
Mhm.
And the growth in that can still be remembering your person and appreciating the impact they had on who you are now. But it doesn't mean that what you're taking from them and the lessons they've left with you are always happy.
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
I relate to that so heavily, obviously having lost my
right.
mom and also thinking about, my father lives far away. And so there's a lot of experiences where I think they should be here. What do I hold myself in this moment? And it's not always to a standard of growth. Sometimes it's to a standard of survival. Can
That's
I be
fine.
okay?
That's fair. There's a
Exactly.
season for that
Yeah.
too.
Being okay with not being okay in those moments when everyone wants a smile on my
Mm,
face, it becomes an opportunity to give them a chance to witness what it looks like to grieve publicly and not in a I'm making everyone around me uncomfortable way, although do it if you need to. I'm certainly not going to slow you down. But in a this is real life. Real life is not glossy and shiny and covered in happy colors all the time. Sometimes it is a little bit dull or heavy. And that's important to honor as we realize we can come through a big loss like this and not be completely trapped in ourselves.
I think that ties also into the concept of imperfect love
Mm,
because that's about the relationships that we have and seeing how people can really mean everything to each other, even recognizing that you can't be everything for anyone.
mhm.
And relationships are all imperfect, as wonderful as they may be. But it's also about your relationship to yourself and forgiving yourself when you can't be exactly who you want to be right then.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to put it. Forgiving yourself that you can't be who you want to be right then is necessary in all aspects, but especially when we're thinking about being parents, whether we are grieving as
Mm-hmm.
actively parenting and grieving at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
whether we're the non-birthing parent and we
Mm-hmm.
don't know what our role is,
Mm-hmm.
being a parent while you are grieving.
Yeah.
What do you see? What are people telling you stories of that make it a little bit lighter, a little bit more realistic, and not just this idealized, don't worry, I grieve so beautifully that I bake cakes every day and they are
Yeah.
magical. And we have this, Stepford wife silly behavior.
No. Well, I mean, are we grieving for an experience that we had imagined? Are we grieving for a medical complexity that our child has that we're managing now with them, or something that's happened to us, either acutely or a
Yeah.
chronic issue that we're dealing with that has changed the parent that we are? So I think this comes up really often. We could go down any of those paths, right? But I think this comes up really often in grief for the parenthood we imagined versus the reality. Grief
Mm-hmm.
for an experience we recognize that's influencing our children in a way that we hadn't thought we'd be bringing into their lives. So, for example, in Kelly's story, she talks about an illness in her partner and also her own life altering illness experience. And she talks about how if she has any grief for her illness, it's for that loss of innocence, that loss of security for her family, for her kids. And she says that she hopes that as her children grow, um, all the ways that they have been forced to become self-sufficient beyond their years will turn into a gift rather than a wound.
Mm.
So I think that grieving in the expectation of what we envision for parenthood versus our day-to-day living of parenthood, that's that's where a lot of this is. That's where there's the disconnect, right? The suffering is in the gap, as they say.
The suffering is in the gap. And that,
That's not me. That's going
yeah,
back many religious traditions over many. I did
you
not
didn't.
invent that, but I tried to.
I agree. Yes. But I love bringing it back around because I think that's something we do in grief. We look for the new answer. We look for the clearer pathway. We look for the simplest
Mm,
conclusion. And so to throw back to, no, my dear, suffering is in the gap. What is the lack?
mhm,
What are you attached to? What have you
mhm,
painted your future as with permanent ink as opposed to
mhm,
watercolors and
mhm,
adding some fluidity to what you're going through and how much
mhm,
that can release our suffering and our experience
mhm.
of loss. Rebecca, let's talk for a moment about the non-birthing parent and even extended family members. How does pregnancy loss and fertility issues impact the relationships? What do you witness and are you hearing from the people you work with about how those relationships change between them and their partners as life goes on?
Yeah, I think we don't think about that side of things as much. That's really important to consider. And I think another aspect of grief in family building struggles can come in the rupture of relationships or the disruption of the relationships that we had hoped to have because of the stress of parenthood or the stress of fertility treatments. I think about a couple of things. In Marissa's story, for example, she and her wife go through building their family in several different ways. One of those ways is fostering. And they have and had a really challenging experience of fostering. And we see by hearing her story that as deeply as these people love each other, that can't make this process an easy one. Love is important, central, indispensable, but not enough. And so, we see and we wonder along with her, like, will their relationship survive this kind of experience? And Marissa also is the birthing parent in this story. And how does that impact her relationship with her wife and the dynamics of their family going through pregnancy and foster, potential adoption, all those kinds of complicated layers that play into each other and aren't always the smoothest connections, right?
Yeah, it makes me think about
Yeah.
how partners and co-parents can support one another or are learning to support one another through that experience
Mhm.
of grief, because even though they're grieving
Mhm.
together, they're also isolated in it and likely processing it and
Mhm.
understanding loss in very different ways. So
Yeah.
what do you think about how they can create some safe space for one another to really be honest without trying to fix it for each other, or again pretend that they're okay so the other feels great.
Right. Well, without speaking for them, I will say that I know
Yeah.
therapy. Therapy was a big thing for their family, really, really helpful for their family. Um, I think having an outside perspective, so whether that is a therapist or depending on your network, your support network, family and friends who can give perspective on what's
Mhm.
happening. That's, of course, a tricky balance because everyone who knows you, who isn't your more objective medical professional or
Mhm.
therapist, they have a stake in the
Yeah.
situation. So you still have to think about how that might play into it. But I think just trying to communicate with each other, being open, talking about it. Then again, I mean, not overthinking everything either. There's a point where we can get so deep into analyzing ourselves and our motivations and our experiences that we lose sight of what they mean in this moment.
Mhm. Yeah, I hear that and I think about, well, that's ego mode, right? Trying to control and
Mm,
limit any damage we
mm,
might experience and
mm,
come out on top, so to speak, as an
mm,
understanding, intelligent, integrated, fully integrated, permanently integrated kind of
mm,
a person, which we know doesn't exist, but in the middle of a stressor like
mm,
grief and ongoing loss and ongoing
mm,
difficulty from that, it's an incredibly
mm,
difficult thing to get out of that mindset, especially if you're used to being able to
mm.
problem solve or think your way through big issues, or even exert
Yeah,
control.
yeah. It makes me think also about the way that grief changes our relationships with the partner, non-birthing partner, other family members, but also grief about the way the ways that these experiences can change parts of ourselves that we didn't realize we'd need to sacrifice to become
Yeah.
parents. And there are a few examples where people talk about feeling so different inside themselves after an experience and how surreal it really is that others can't just see that written all over
Mm.
them. So I remember Anna talking about she's her child has, they have a very complicated pregnancy and delivery, and her child is still in the hospital. She goes out to, I think it's a grocery store. She goes out into the world trying to do an ordinary errand. And she doesn't understand how people can't just glance at her and know her story in a
Mm-hmm.
second. And she says, I was so raw and defenseless. I felt like I should be see-through.
Mm,
And that part of ourselves we don't realize will be
yeah.
changing in relationship with
Well, and it
ourselves
takes a
too.
lot of self-awareness to be able to tell that story as well. And I think that's something that you've done so powerfully is create a container for these parents to tell their stories,
Mm-hmm.
because the act of storytelling is crucial to how we process our losses. I'm curious
Mm-hmm.
how sharing your own story of pregnancy loss has influenced how you view the stories of other parents who are experiencing grief.
Mm. I mean, it's just made me feel like this is the biggest privilege and honor that I've ever had. It's been the most rewarding thing in my whole professional life as a physician, otherwise, to collaborate with these women and help retell their stories and shepherd them into the world. I I just appreciate them so much for their willingness to share their stories, and their bravery has really reaffirmed my belief so many years ago that if we could use these stories for something bigger than ourselves, it would lift all of us up and create that community for others too.
Gosh, even as a medical professional, that's making me think about how grief can be ignored in healthcare settings. And as
Mm-hmm.
someone who has experienced it, right, you have far more
Mm-hmm.
attunement to people who are going through that as well. But on the whole, medical professionals don't demonstrate that kind of, I mean, we could say bedside manner, I suppose, but um, ability to acknowledge the intensity of grief and those experiences
Mm-hmm.
in the moment, especially during high risk pregnancies or traumatic pregnancies. I'm in my 40s now, and the fact that I've witnessed plenty of friends have successful pregnancies and laugh at the being called a geriatric pregnancy at this point. But at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, like even that label puts a lot on women who are
Mm-hmm.
families who are trying to conceive or who are going through things because there's added risk. And I think it almost disregards the grief someone might have carried into that room in the first place. So how can healthcare providers, in your
Mm-hmm.
opinion, do a better job acknowledging and supporting what might be griefy in the middle of those moments?
You've talked about how people begin to heal when they feel heard. And I mean that's it. Listening is the core of medical
Mhm.
care. There are all sorts of technical things we can do. Those are important, necessary, fantastic. But if we aren't listening to our patient stories, we're never really going to understand what they need. You know, this also this is about how other people's stories can build empathy in us. And if we listen as medical professionals, but also everybody, you don't have to be in medicine to do this, right? If we listen to the stories of others, it really can change our perspective on our own
Mhm.
experiences. It makes me think about in one of my collaborators, one of my closest friends. Her story is the first one you hear within the book, aside from my own. And this is Tess. She's a child psychiatrist. And so, of all people, she has insight into these things, right? But she talks about, so you see in the book a conversation that she and I are having on the phone when we're both at very different moments in our parenthoods. And I'm still going through all sorts of complications. She has ordinary, so-called ordinary pregnancy with its ordinary challenges, and then a really inconsolable, challenging infant. And she and I are just not able to connect in that moment when we need such different things and we're going through such different things. But um, we do stay in touch enough that we're able to come back around to each other. And the reason that I bring this up in the context of your question is that she talks about then in her story, remembering when she first heard, when I first told her what we'd actually been going through, when I finally opened up to her. And she talks about now from her perspective as Elena's mother, as her daughter's mother, that they'd been through their own challenges. She couldn't believe how insensitive she had been to my experience because she had memorized what miscarriage meant. She had heard all the terms and learned it in medical school, but she had no idea what I had really been going through. And it was in being a mother through a really challenging time herself that she came to understand that all of us were dealing with something. And she says, I began to understand that motherhood was laden with grief and that motherhood could bring grief even to those who did not yet look like mothers to the world. So she began to realize that these stories were all around her. And again, she's a psychiatrist, but anyone can do that. Anyone can realize the stories that are all around us. And that's the foundation for empathy.
Gosh, moving out of her role as a clinician and back toward her humanity, her role as a human.
Right.
It's hard to do.
It wasn't that she was insensitive before. She just had no
And I was going to say
context.
the same thing when you said she realized she was
Yeah.
insensitive. I'm like, no, she has no awareness. That's not
No,
insensitivity.
no. She's the same person. She was still wonderful then. She just
Yeah.
couldn't get it.
I think that's a beautiful thing to say for anyone who's listening as well. If you felt insensitive in a moment or you've said something
Mm-hmm.
that you realized foot in mouth, why did I say that? You're not being insensitive, you
Mm-hmm.
lack awareness. And it's
Mm-hmm.
when you have awareness and then you say the thing, well, now insensitivity has kicked in. There's that great moment. I don't know if you're a Marvel fan. My family are, and we watched the TV show Loki. And
I
I,
know it.
yeah,
I
I
know
don't
it.
remember what moment is happening, but he says,
I have
yeah,
teenagers.
perfect. Loki says something like, yes, yes, very sad. Anyway, and he moves on. And I say it throughout the house all the time, just as a tongue in
Yeah.
cheek. Yes, yes, very sad. Anyway, we're moving on now.
Mm-hmm.
Back to what I said. Please clean your room.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever that is. That's a choice. That is an intentionality that we are moving away from people, right? And in everything we're doing,
Yeah.
especially as medical professionals, as grievers, as humans, as parents, we're trying to move toward one another and create connection. And I think it's beautiful for her to have recognized, there's an opportunity here to create
Yeah.
new connection.
I think that also brings up the idea of pivots and that there there are moments in these stories where our lives go one way and they could have gone a very different way. So Tess is in this moment in her parenthood. I'm in this other moment. They're not able to connect, converge, interact. But in so many of these stories, you actually see small details that say one person's story has in common with mine and how our stories each go very differently. So the result, I hope, what's unusual about this book being a shared memoir, a collaborative effort of storytelling, is you see how our stories intersect and overlap, and the result is that each story gives insight into the others. So you may see me going through a prenatal diagnostic test, chorionic villus sampling, a CVS, one of these invasive tests, and then we're pausing, and then you see another family going through the same test, and the outcomes may be different, or an amnio, these different kinds of prenatal testing, they lead to different results and different choices for that family. And there are a lot of moments where you just, at least I got the sense of, wow, just one thing could have pivoted and everything would be different. And I think that that's what's really fascinating is these connections between the stories allow us to imagine how our lives could be different too.
Yeah, there's a shared empathy that grows in those pathways between us. And
Mhm.
And it gives us
Right.
permission to not have to be a monolith, to not have to be the same and
Mhm.
or have the same interpretation of what has
Mhm.
happened or what might be possible, but that we are also still
Mhm.
connected to one another and that we can come together, we can support each other through it, even if we have different
Mhm.
lenses that we're approaching. It's not a, "No, we don't agree, so
Yes.
you must be isolated from one another." It's actually such a beautiful, I
Yes.
mean, that's, you called the book Held Together. That's exactly what it is.
And I think that also highlights the fact that this is not a sad book. These are very challenging
Mhm,
stories. A lot of them, they're laced with grief for sure, but they're deeply
mhm.
hopeful. And they're about how we get through grief as individuals in community. Um, they're about how we make meaning out of even the most difficult things.
Rebecca, having you as a guest on this show has been a total gift. Thank you so much. And where can people find you and your work if they're interested in hearing more?
So yes, I would love for people to go check out my website, because if you are going to buy this book, and thank you so much if you do, if you get it through there, there's a link where you can either find a local or indie bookstore that either is in your neighborhood or can ship to you to support those kinds of small businesses, or a link that's an affiliate link to Postpartum Support International, a group that does work supporting maternal and family mental health. So if you are willing to go buy hardcover, ebook, audiobook through my website, it will help direct you to a link that maybe can do something else good with your efforts too.
I love it. Rebecca, thank you so much. Y'all need to go get a copy of this book. It's stunning. And the book is called Held Together, a shared memoir of motherhood, medicine, and imperfect love. Thank you, Rebecca, for being here with me.
And thank you, Mandy. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And thank you for creating a space where grief really can coexist with joy and meaning.
Thank you for listening to episode 197 of Restorative Grief. Rebecca's insights from the stories she has gathered are not just a collection of something nice to read after a long day's work. These are raw, real, and inspiring conversations about recognizing the both and nature of grief and resilience in its everyday forms, like showing up to a party when you can't imagine the conversations or sharing heavy news yet again with people who would rather see through rose-colored glasses all the time. I truly hope you'll snag yourself a copy of this work, and you can find the link to Rebecca's website in the show notes, as well as the link to the Patreon for a little workbook on this conversation too. We all have stories of imperfect love, and whether we are a parent or not, we benefit from learning about the stories of others as we heal. If this is your first time listening to the show, thank you for choosing to listen in and to become a part of the Restorative Grief network, world, group, whatever we are. This is a place where you can ask some hard questions of yourself and of others who are grieving in a way that builds empathy and invites you into a deeper understanding of who you are and who you are becoming. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. There's a new one every Sunday, whether it's an interview or an essay. And you can become a patron to get exclusive episodes like this one much earlier than they are released to the general public. And those episodes are a little bit longer and have some more content as well, so it's totally worth it. Check out the show notes again to visit Rebecca's website, become a patron, or reach out to me if you have questions, or come find me on social media and we can connect. And as always, before we go, one last thing. Please remember, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.